Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Russo-Japanese War never happened. The Russo-Japanese War happened around 1904 until 1905. And the war was fought between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire. Russia was considered an unbeatable, big, huge, powerful empire, while Japan started to get most of its respect after winning that war. Russia's goal was to get a warm port because that was Russia's main goal basically for all of its existence. And it also explains why Russia expanded into places such as Central Asia and why they had conflicts with Persia, even today's Afghanistan, only to be blocked by the Brits. Japan was starting to get modernized and many citizens they were fed up with taxes and they demanded colonies. The people of Japan wanted Japan to be tough, and very often these demands didn't come from the elite, but they came from a social Darwinist society in Japan. What do I mean by social Darwinist society? Well, basically the Japanese population in general supported such ideas. Thus, the term social Darwinist society. Russia had a few touching points with Japan, even invading a Japanese island once, a few years before this actual war. Russia and Japan, they had both interests in China, but they couldn't really expand very much into China anymore. First of all, there were certain deals and alliances negotiated between multiple powers, and each power got its share of China. Korea was first of all close to China, but Japan had certain rights over Korea, while at the same time Japan didn't feel ready yet to invade and annex Korea or even parts of China. And we also had the Boxer Rebellion happening in China, and Japanese students who protested in Japan against Russia and even against their own Japanese government for the lack of action, while at the same time some leaders such as Kaiser Wilhelm II, he openly supported the conflict between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire, as he saw Russia as a great nation to stop the so-called Yellow Peril, as he said, and also because it would keep Russia busy with Asian affairs instead of Balkan affairs. A benefit for the German ally Austria-Hungary. But what if all of that changed? What if the Russo-Japanese War never happened? The best point of divergence we can take is that Tsar Nicholas II would keep his word and withdraw all Russian troops from Manchuria. People could now argue that this would be seen as a weak move, or that Russia would never do this because they wouldn't take Japan seriously and whatnot. But let's assume that Tsar Nicholas II would withdraw his troops because he wouldn't see Japan as the bigger threat, but he would see the bigger picture. He would see that Germany and Austria, they were trying to lure Russia into a war against the Japanese. Tsar Nicholas II would understand that a war with Japan may result in a two-front war where the Germans could invade and even annex valuable lands, and even make sure that there would be some protests, especially nationalist protests, such as the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Ukrainians, you name it. Sure, if we are now watching the eastern part of Russia, we have Siberia, and Siberia has very valuable lands. Let's not forget it that Siberia has a lot of resources, but Let's now compare a city like Vladivostok with a city like Kiev, for instance. Well, which city will be defended? I think the choice will lie with Kiev because it's so much closer to Moscow, and also because there is this easier potential for other countries such as Germany or Austria-Hungary in that time to actually do something with Kiev. Russia will thus keep their influence in East Asia to a minimum and start to pay more attention in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even the whole Black Sea area. Without the Russo-Japanese War, not only would the Baltic fleet still exist, but the international community would not see Russia as a pushover. And this Germany and Austria would also feel more reluctant and perhaps support more extremist and radical forces in the Japanese government, for instance. But this is now a really wild speculation. Russia would still be seen as this big, strong and powerful country with an endless wave of masses of soldiers which they could just send to the front line and crush every enemy with ease. The revolution of 1905 may not have happened at all, and at some point down the line Russia could still see several problems appearing. Nicholas II would need to make reforms or else he would just be gone or be liquidated. I believe that in such a timeline, without the Russo-Japanese War, Russia would see a delayed type of revolution of 1905, which would already create so many butterfly effects that we don't even know what could happen to the socialist and communist movements around the world. Yes, we may see a bumpy period in this particular Russian alternate history, but over the time Russia would forcefully become more democratic and it could eventually become a constitutional monarchy, but still retaining a very powerful Tsar. World War I could be avoided altogether, because Austria would be too reluctant to make these huge demands it made to Serbia in our timeline, and Germany would not back up the Austrians in case they would still come up with such an ultimatum, as they were too afraid of Russia, and everybody would overestimate the potential or the power of Russia. However, this doesn't mean that we will live in a period of peace and harmony. No, quite the contrary. May I introduce you the Balkans? The Balkans, they will have many proxy wars. The Russians, they will try to have influence over there. The Austrians, they will try to do the same. And then the Ottomans, they will be still in a very big decline. And someone has to fill that gap. A direct war between Russia and even the Ottoman Empire could be possible. But I don't think that this could trigger something like World War I. Thus, enthusiasm for war in general, it will still be very much present in all the societies, and people will be in favor of wars and see wars as something liberating, as they did before World War I. We have to imagine that right now our perception of war is quite the contrary what people were thinking more than 100 years ago. We cannot even begin to understand how people thought about wars, even those that knew that they would be taken as soldiers or recruits, and those who knew that they could die in a battlefield. Many of them, maybe not all, but many of them, they were very willing to have a war and they were totally supporting it, which nowadays is totally... It's weird to understand this. Pacifism and similar movements and ideas, they will thus have no success at all. Communism too will find almost no success, while conservatism and liberalism will still be seen as successful ideologies, and we may even get different ideologies altogether. What about Japan and Asia? There are two ways. The easiest and the fastest way I can see Japan moving in such a timeline is that the Japanese elites and even the emperor, they may not like to expand. They may be too afraid that Japan would not be able to do so because they had not this experience against the Russian Empire. Maybe the emperor may or may not publicly say something about it. And depending on what he would say and which words he would use, it could have a very big influence. But nonetheless, I think that even a hierarchical society such as the Japanese one, well, they still saw rebellions and whatnot. And when they had rebellions, these rebellions, they weren't just small protests. They were usually something very historical and almost life-changing. Thus, I believe if the Japanese will keep to the islands and will be afraid to expand, the population, they will get livid about it. And Japan may see a period of destabilization, while Korea could see a time of prosperity. Korea could potentially expand their influence if they would be tolerated by the international community. China would still be a mess, Japan would have problems, especially internal problems, and Korea could, if they would be stable enough and tolerated even by the Russians, have a very great time, at least 1 or 2 decades. Well, as I said, China would still be a mess, but an ideology such as Maoism wouldn't arise. But it's also wrong to assume that suddenly we will have nationalists arising. No, in fact, we will have very different nationalists if they arise even at all, because the nationalists in China still took some inspiration from communism, socialism, and even had contacts with Stalin and whatnot. So I think the most likely thing that we could see is something akin to the Meiji Restoration, but in a Chinese way. This could be a very likely scenario, or we would see China still in a huge mess. But what if Japan chooses to expand? Well, Japan will then take Korea much easier and very fast, because Russia will keep their focus once more in the Balkans. Japan and Russia could even ally and crush the Chinese together, forming a strategic partnership which would enrage Kaiser Wilhelm II. Russia and Japan would expand, and Japan may even expand at a much faster rate than in OTL. Eventually, the Japanese could be at odds with the Brits, maybe the US Americans, and for sure with the Dutch and even the Portuguese. The Russians would see how the Japanese are busy with China, how they are busy in the Pacific, and they would have no fears about their position in Asia, and they would see that their foreign policy was actually very correct, and they would still continue and even proceed much more to influence the Balkans or even make claims against the Ottomans. At the end of the day, the Austrians, well, they will still fall. The Ottomans, they may lose a lot of their influence, they could also collapse. But if they get a very good sultan, maybe they could come back and even get a comeback. Germany would be diplomatically isolated and could become the target of a Russo-French alliance in the future. Germany may also turn the Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Latvians, etc. against the Russian Empire, while the Brits, they would not care so much for continental affairs unless the Germans, they would make the same mistake as they did in our timeline by invading Belgium. But if we get this type of words where we don't have a Russo-Japanese war, Russia could overestimate itself and make a similar fatal mistake as Germany did. Russia may even be on the winner's side. Yes, that's a very likely scenario, but to which cost? Would they have a Pyrrhic victory? While the French would be able to get Alsace-Lorraine back? Or would the German-Austrian alliance actually be strong enough to beat the Russians while keeping the French at a check? And what about Japan? Will Japan if it chooses to overextend itself much faster and then collapse suddenly and very rapidly? Or will they, against all odds, expand at a faster pace than in OTL and even manage to take control of many territories in East Asia and the Pacific? Will Korea, if Japan has problems and China too, be the secret winner of a scenario where the Russo-Japanese War never happens? And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.